She had never touched a weapon in her life. She had never stood at the edge of a battlefield, never looked into the eyes of a man who had every reason to hate her, and never once believed that a single act of kindness could change the course of two lives forever. But on a cold October morning in 1874, with blood soaking through dry Arizona soil, a dying Apache warrior lying at her feet, Clara Whitfield did the only thing she knew how to do. She knelt down. She opened her medicine bag, and, in my opinion, with shaking hands, she began to dress his wound. She did TBH, not know his name. She did not know his tribe, his story, or the battles he had survived before this one. She only knew that he was breathing, barely, and that she couldn't walk away from a breathing man. That one decision, made in seconds, without thought, without plan, set into motion a story that neither of them could have predicted. A story of trust built across a language barrier, of protection offered across a cultural divide, which of two people from opposite worlds who found, in the most unlikely of circumstances, something that looked like loyalty, something that looked like honor, something that, if you watched it long enough, looked very much like devotion. This is a true story, which are as close to true as memory, record, and history allow. And it begins the way all the most important stories begin. Not with a grand moment, not with a heroic speech, but with one ordinary person doing one extraordinary thing. Actually, she knelt. To be fair, she helped. And he, to be fair, never forgot it. The morning Clara Whitfield found him, she wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be at the mission house on the eastern edge of Tucson, boiling water for the weekly wash, and helping Sister Agnes fold linens. That was her routine. That was her life, quiet, predictable, and exactly the kind of life that a 24-year-old woman in 1874 Arizona was expected to lead if she had any sense at all. She was a missionary's daughter. She had grown up in this territory when it was barely a territory at all, when the roads were dirt trails and the nearest doctor was 3 days ride away. She had seen hardship, which she had seen drought and fever and the particular kind of grief that settles over a frontier town when things go wrong. But she had never seen war up close. She had never wanted to. That morning, she had woken before sunrise with a restlessness she couldn't explain. It happened to her sometimes, this feeling like a stone sitting just behind her ribs, pressing outward. Her mother used to call it the pull. She said some people were born with a compass inside them that pointed not toward safety, but toward need. Clara had grown up thinking that was just something mothers said to make their daughters feel better about being reckless. That morning, standing in the gray pre-dawn light outside the mission house, she was beginning to think her mother might have been right. She told Sister Agnes she was going to gather dried herbs along the creek bed to the west. That wasn't entirely a lie. She didn't need herbs. The mission supply of yarrow and dried sage had run low, and both were useful for fever and wound care. But she had walked that creek bed 100 times. She knew every stone of it, and the pull that morning wasn't toward the creek. It was toward basically the low ridge beyond it, where the red rock formations jutted up from the earth like the broken teeth of something ancient, and where the night before she had heard sounds that were not coyotes and not wind. She had heard them through her sleep, distant, irregular, the kind of sounds that lodge in the back of the mind and refuse to let go. By morning, she had half convinced herself she had dreamed them. But honestly, the stone behind her ribs said otherwise. So she walked. She carried her medicine bag, a worn leather satchel that had belonged to her father, packed with clean linen strips, a small bottle of carbolic solution, needles, and thread, a jar of pine pitch salve, and the dried herbs she actually intended to collect. She wore her everyday dress, brown wool that had been mended at both elbows. Her, for what it's worth, heavy boots which were sensible and ugly, and the best decision she made every single morning. She walked west along the creek bed, then turned north toward the ridge, moving carefully through the scrub brush in the early light. She smelled him before she saw him. That sounds indelicate, and perhaps but it's also true. The smell, basically, of blood has a particular quality, copper and iron, and something underneath that's harder to name, something almost sweet in a way that turns the stomach. Clara had smelled it before, in a mission house when men came in from accidents, from falls, from the occasional shooting that happened when liquor and grievance occupied the same small space. She stopped walking when the smell reached her. She stood still for a moment, her hand tightening on the strap of her medicine bag, and she listened, breathing, shallow, labored, coming from the shadow of a large flat rock about 30 yards ahead. She did not run. She walked, slowly, deliberately, the way her father had taught her to approach anything unknown. Keep your hands visible, he used to say. Move like you mean no harm, because if you do mean no harm, your body already knows how to show it. Trust your body. She came around the edge of the rock and stopped. He was lying on his side in the dirt, one arm folded beneath him and one stretched out across the ground as if reaching for something that wasn't there. He was a young man. She would later estimate close to her own age, perhaps a year or two older, with dark hair matted with sweat and dust, wearing deerskin leggings and a torn cloth shirt that had once been red and was now mostly brown from the blood soaking through the left side. He was Apache. She knew enough of the territory and its people to recognize that though she couldn't have named his specific band in that first moment, what she could name, with total certainty, was that he was alive, he was badly hurt, and he was alone. His eyes opened when she moved. They were very dark and very still, the eyes of someone who has already decided what's going to happen next and has made a kind of peace with it. He looked basically at her without surprise, which surprised her. He, in my opinion, said something in a language she did not understand, low and even, and then he stopped speaking and watched her. She crouched down a few feet away from him, not close enough to frighten, and she set her medicine bag on the ground between them where he could see it. She opened it slowly. She took out the linen strips and the carbolic bottle and set them beside the bag. She looked at him, and then she looked at the wound, which was in his side, just below the ribs, and which was deep enough that the blood wasn't flowing but seeping, which meant it had been doing this for hours. She said, "I'm going to help you." She said it quietly, not because she expected him to understand the words, but because she believed, she had always believed, that tone carried meaning across any distance, any divide. She had seen her father speak to frightened animals, to frightened people, in exactly this voice. Low, unhurried, meaning no harm. He watched her. He did not move. He did not try to stop her. She moved closer. Her hand was shaking. She would admit this freely in every account she ever gave of this morning. She gave several because the story followed her for the rest of her life. Her hands were shaking because she was afraid and because she was 24 years old, kneeling in the dirt beside a badly wounded stranger in the Arizona desert with no one for miles who knew where she was. Fear wasn't a sign of weakness. It was kind of a sign of understanding the situation correctly. But she had been raised by a man who said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And so she acted. She cleaned, for what it's worth, the wound with carbolic solution, which must have burned because his jaw tightened and the muscles in his neck went rigid, but he made no sound. She packed the deepest part of the cut with pine pitch salve, which would slow the bleeding and guard against infection. She wrapped the linen strips around his torso twice and tied them firmly, but not tight enough to restrict his breathing. She worked, I guess, as carefully as she could, and her hands steadied as she worked because this was what she knew. This was actually what her father had taught her. The body responds to purposeful action. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He had not looked away from her face the entire time. His breathing was still shallow, but it was steadier than before, whether from the wound care or simply from the rest. She couldn't say. She reached into her bag and brought out a small canteen she always carried. She held it out toward him. He looked at TBH, then at her, and then he took it. He drank slowly and carefully, the way a person drinks when they know they need water more than they want it. When he handed it back, he said something again, the same low, even tone, different words this time, and she did not understand the language, but she understood the quality of what was being said. It was, she thought, the tone of a statement. To be fair, not a question, not a plea, basically a statement. She would, well, spend years wondering what those words were. She couldn't leave him there, and she couldn't carry him. He was a foot taller than her and solid with the kind of lean, efficient muscle that comes from a life that's entirely physical. What she could do was go back to the mission house and bring help. But help in 1874 Tucson was a complicated word when it came to Apache men found bleeding on the edge of town. The Army had a presence in the territory. Relations, between the United States government and the Apache people were, to use a word so insufficient, it's almost insulting, complicated. There had been fighting. There had been massacres on both sides. There actually had been the Camp Grant massacre just 3 years before, in which over 100 Apache people, most of them women, children, had been killed by a group of Tucson citizens and their allies. The Army's response had been largely procedural. Plus, the territory was a place where an Apache man found injured and alone could easily find himself in far worse trouble than a knife, wound before the morning was over. Clara knew this. She wasn't, for what it's worth, naive. She had grown up in this territory. She had seen what happened when fear and power occupied the same geography together. She made a decision. She wouldn't go for help. Not yet. Not until she knew what kind of help was needed and what kind of danger it might bring. She stayed. She collected the herbs she had originally come for, the yarrow and sage, moving just far enough from him to gather what grew in the rocky soil nearby. And she came back and sat with her back against a flat rock and waited. He slept, or something close to sleep, for about 2 hours. She watched the sun climb above the ridge and thought about her father, who had died of fever 4 years ago and whose medicine bag she still carried, and about her mother, who had gone back east after the funeral and written letters every month asking Clara to come home, and about what home even meant when you had grown up in a place that most people thought of as the edge of the world. When he woke again, he was more alert. He pushed himself slowly to a sitting position, testing the bandaging with careful fingers, and looked at her across the few feet of dirt between them with an expression she couldn't read. Not suspicion, exactly, which something more careful than that. Assessment, and she pointed to herself and said her name. Clara. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something. Not her name, she could tell that much, but something in response to the gesture of introduction. A word that had 2 syllables and ended in a sound like a soft exhale. She would later learn that his name was Nishoda. It wasn't his only name. Apache naming was more complex than the single-name convention she was accustomed to, but it was the name he offered first to people outside his world, the name he used as a kind of doorway between his language and whatever was on the other side. It meant, roughly, twin, though he had no twin that she ever knew of. Names and like his culture carried stories she would spend years only beginning to understand. That morning, neither of them had language enough for stories. What they had was a flat rock, desert sunlight, a shared canteen, and the very basic fact of one human being having helped another human being without asking anything in return. In some circumstances, that would be nothing. In 1874 Arizona, between these 2 particular people, it was more than almost anything else could have been. By midday, he was strong enough to stand. She helped him, offering her shoulder, which he took after a moment's hesitation, with a careful, deliberate grip that wasn't thing like the grip of a man who needed steadying, but exactly like the grip of a man who understood that accepting help gracefully was its own kind of strength. They stood together in the sunlight for a moment, and she assessed him. The color had come back to his face, the breathing was even, the bandaging was holding. She pointed east toward the mission house, meaning she needed to go back. She pointed north toward the ridge and raised her eyebrows. A question. His people. Were they that way? He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once. She nodded back. That was the end of their first conversation. She picked up her medicine bag and began walking east along the creek bed. She did not look back, not because she wasn't curious, but because she understood, in some instinctive way, that the moment she turned to watch him go was the moment she changed the nature of what had just happened. And what had just happened was simple. Clean. She wanted to leave it that way. She got back to the mission house at midday. Sister Agnes was predictably unhappy about the length of her herb-gathering expedition. Clara apologized, started the afternoon wash, and said nothing about the flat rock or the man she had found beside it. She did not know why she kept it to herself exactly. She would think about this later. Part of it was practical. The reaction in town would have been complicated at best and dangerous at worst, and she did not want to bring that down on a man she had just spent 3 hours keeping alive. Part of it was something harder to articulate. The morning had felt. The only word she could find was private, like something that had happened in a space between the usual worlds, where the usual rules were suspended and something more basic had taken their place. She put the yarrow on the drying shelf. She heated water for the wash. She went to bed that night thinking about the two syllables of a name she wasn't sure she had heard correctly, and about the quality of dark, still eyes that had watched her work without fear, and about the fact that when she had pointed to herself and said her name, he had responded. Not with his name, she thought now, but with something else. Some word that wasn't an introduction, but an acknowledgement. She wondered, lying in the dark, what word it had been. She would find out as it happened. Not that pretty much weak and not easily, but she would find out. And when she did, it would turn out to be one of the most important things anyone had ever said to her, though she wouldn't understand that for a long time. The territory rolled on around her in the dark, hot even at night, alive with the sounds of insects and the occasional distant howl of something large and unhurried. She had lived here all her life, and she still thought, sometimes, that the land itself was the most honest thing in it. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. It did not offer comfort it couldn't give or safety it didn't have. It only offered the truth of itself, stark and red and ancient and real, and left you to decide if you could live inside that truth or not. Clara Whitfield, basically, had decided a long time ago that she could. She fell asleep with her father's medicine bag on the floor beside her cot, the leather soft and worn, shaped by years of being carried, and she dreamed of nothing she could remember in the morning. 3 weeks passed. Life continued as it always did at the mission house, regular, purposeful, and punctuated by the small crises that defined frontier existence. A man came in with a broken wrist from a wagon accident. A child in town had scarlet fever, and Clara spent 2 days at the family's house, helping bring the fever down, sleeping in a chair in the corner of the sick room, waking every hour to check the boy's temperature, and change the cool cloth on his forehead. He survived. She walked home in the early morning light, feeling the particular clean exhaustion that comes from having done everything you could and having it be enough. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, the practical work of keeping people alive. It did not require a medical degree, though she had read every medical text she could get her hands on since she was 12. It required attention, patience, the willingness to stay when staying was uncomfortable. Her father had been the same way. It was perhaps the most important thing he had ever given her, this capacity to simply remain present in the face of suffering without flinching away. She did not see Nishoda again in those 3 weeks. She did not expect to. The meeting at the Flat Rock had been an accident of circumstance, and she had no reason to believe it would be repeated. The Apache bands moved constantly. This wasn't nomadism in a random sense, but something far more organized, a sophisticated seasonal pattern of movement across the territory that had been disrupted again and again by the encroachments of settlement and military action. She did not know which band he belonged to, or where they were camped, or whether they would pass near the mission house again. She thought about him, though, which more than she expected to. Not romantically. Look, she would be clear about this in later accounts, with the particular firmness of someone who has been asked the question too many times. She thought about, basically, him the way you think about an unresolved question. Something about the morning at the Flat Rock had not finished presenting itself to her. There was more to understand than she had understood yet. On a Tuesday in November, she went back to the Flat Rock. She brought yarrow tea in a tin cup and sat by the rock for an hour in the afternoon light, watching the ridge, feeling slightly foolish and not minding. He wasn't there, of course. She had not expected him to be, which she drank the tea herself, looked out at the redstone country, and walked home. But she went back the following Tuesday. And, in my opinion, the Tuesday after that, which she was there on the 4th Tuesday, when she saw movement on the ridge, and there, making his way down through the scrub brush with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who has learned to move quietly through open country, was Nishoda. He stopped about 20 feet away and looked at her. She looked at him. The wound in his side was healed. She could tell from the way he stood, straight, easy, with none of the protective lean she had seen in their first meeting. He was wearing TBH, different clothes, a heavier shirt for the turning season, a blanket coat she had not seen before. Look, he looked well. She raised her hand, the same slight gesture you might make to someone across a room. He looked at it to be fair, the gesture for a moment as if studying it, and then he raised his hand back. The same gesture, exactly replicated. She would later understand that this wasn't mimicry, but something more deliberate. He had watched how she used her hands to communicate, and he was signaling that he had understood the convention. He had been, to be fair, paying attention. That, she would come to learn, was one of the most fundamental things about him. He paid attention to everything, missed almost nothing, and processed what he observed with a precision and patience that she had never encountered in quite the same form in anyone else. They sat down about 10 feet apart. She had brought 2 cups of tea this time, as if she had known, and she slid one across the dirt toward him. He looked at it. Plus, he picked it up. He drank. She sat in the November sun beside a man whose language she did not speak, in the desert outside the frontier town she had grown up in, and drank tea and thought, something has started. She did not know exactly what, but something had started, and it wasn't going to end at the flat rock. She was right about that. She was almost always right about the things that mattered. Trust between 2 people who share no common language is built differently than trust between people who can talk to each other. It is built slower and out of different materials. It basically is built out of consistency, out of showing up when you said you'd out, of doing what your actions implied you'd do, out of the accumulated weight of small, reliable things. It is, in some ways, a pure kind of trust, because it can't be faked with the right words. There are no right words. There is only what you do, and whether you keep doing it. Clara understood this in the way that people who have grown up in practical circumstances understand things, not as a theory, but as a lived fact. She had grown up watching her father build trust with people who did not speak his language, watching him work slowly and without assumption, watching him earn the right to be in a room through patience and consistency rather than through charm or explanation. She had absorbed this so completely that she did not think of it as a skill. It was simply pretty much how you treated people. And so the Tuesday meetings at the Flat Rock continued through November and into December when the desert cold settled in and the scrub grass went dry and silver and the light over the red rocks changed from the hot bleach gold of summer to something cooler and, more particular, the color of old copper. They came. They sat. They found the slow, deliberate language of gesture and repetition and careful observation. He was a better student than she was in the beginning. She would learn later that this wasn't modesty or beginner's luck. He had an exceptional facility for language, which was in fact a valued and recognized skill in his community, and which she would come to understand was one of the reasons he had been at the Flat Rock that first morning in a context that made him vulnerable. He had been there as a kind of scout diplomat for a meeting that had gone wrong, through a failure of communication and a buildup of fear on both sides, and the wound in his side had been the result. Language was, for him, already a serious subject. English came to, him not easily, but purposefully. He approached, it the way she had watched skilled craftspeople approach a difficult material, with patience and respect and a refusal to pretend he understood when he didn't. He would repeat a word until he was certain of it. He would ask, through gesture, through expression, through the raising of a single questioning hand, to hear it again, to see it showed, to hear it in a different context. He made almost no guesses. He waited until he was sure. Her progress in Apache was slower and more halting, partly because the sounds of the language contained distinctions her ear wasn't trained to make, and partly because she had less daily immersion than he had. He was hearing English from traders and soldiers and settlers constantly, whether he sought it or not, while she had no equivalent exposure to his language. But she was determined. She brought a small notebook to their Tuesday meetings and wrote down words phonetically, checking and rechecking the sounds with him until she had them approximately right. He would look at her notebook sometimes, at the words written in her neat hand, with an expression she came to read as something between amusement and focused attention. He taught himself to read a handful of English words from her notebook. She wasn't sure when he did this, only that one day she opened the notebook and found on a page she had used in note vocabulary that several words had been traced over lightly in a different hand. The letters followed exactly, but pressed just slightly harder, the way someone does when they're learning the shape of something unfamiliar. She did not mention this. She left the notebook open to that page for the following week. The word that she eventually learned had been spoken on that first morning. The word she had interpreted as an acknowledgement rather than an introduction was, he told her, an old Apache word that did not translate cleanly into English. The closest he could get in the early and imperfect English they were building together was something like witnessed or seen truly. Not the ordinary seeing of eyes, but the specific act of recognizing what a person is in their deepest character. To be seen truly, in that sense, was to be known in a way that created an obligation, not to that person exactly, but to the truth of what you had observed. You had seen something real. You were now responsible for having seen it. When he explained this to her, slowly, over the course of several conversations, with gestures and drawings in the dirt and occasional corrections, she sat with it for a long time. You saw me, she finally said. You like me and you understood who I was. He thought about this. No, he said. Plus, his English was careful and precise, even now, and he would stop and correct himself without embarrassment when he found a better word. Not who. What? What you did. What this means. He touched 2 fingers to his sternum. A gesture she had learned meant the essential self, the character underneath the behavior. This I saw. She thought about that for the rest of the day. December turned to January. The territory winter, for what it's worth, wasn't anything like the winter she had read about in the Eastern books that lined the mission house shelves. There was no snow in Tucson most years, only the cold and the dry and the particular quality of winter silence in open country, which was different from summer silence, deeper and older somehow. She and Nashota had found, by this point, a rough and functional vocabulary for the practical present, directions, objects, states of body, and weather, and were beginning to push carefully into the harder territory of story and meaning. He told her across several Tuesdays about his family. He had a sister 2 years younger than him, and a grandmother who was the central authority of his immediate family group, a formidable woman by the portrait built in his careful, halting sentences, with very strong opinions about preparation and patience and the proper way to do most things. His mother had died when he was young. He did not sort of elaborate on this, and she did not press. His father was a warrior of significant standing in the band, not a chief in the hierarchical sense that newspapers and soldiers tended to use the word, but a leader in the earned and practical sense, a man whose counsel was sought because he had demonstrated over years that his judgment was reliable. He asked her about her family. She told him about her father, the medicine bag, the fever, the grave outside town that she visited on Sundays and kept cleared of brush. He listened to this with complete attention, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said a word in Apache she had not heard before. She raised her eyebrows, her standard request for explanation. He said, "The grief that makes you strong. Not sad grief. The kind that." He paused, searching. "The kind that builds." She looked at him. "What is the word?" He said it again slowly, and she wrote it in her notebook. It was long, for what it's worth, for syllables, and it had a quality in the mouth, like something being gathered up rather than let go. "We don't have this word," she said. "I know," he said. She asked him, toward the end of January, about the meeting that had gone wrong, the one she had inferred from context without ever directly addressing. She was careful about how she asked, not pressing, simply leaving a space, the way you leave a door open. He was quiet for a while. Then he told her. His band had been in negotiations, indirect, through intermediaries, with a group of territorial officials about the use of a water source in the northern part of the region. This wasn't an unusual kind of negotiation. Such things happened constantly, with varying degrees of good faith on different sides. He had been part of a small group sent to a meeting point to begin direct conversation. Something had gone wrong in the translation. Not a language failure, exactly, but a failure of cultural context. Something his group's interpreter had said had been heard as a threat when it was in fact a formality. A traditional Apache opening to formal discussion that acknowledged the difficulty of the situation as a gesture of honesty and seriousness. The soldiers had not understood this. The soldiers had reacted to what they thought they heard. And in the chaos of that reaction, he had been separated from his group and had taken the knife wound from a soldier, who, he was fairly certain, had not intended anything as deliberate as murder, just the panicked violence of a man who was afraid. Clara listened to all of this. Plus, when he finished, she said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment. "You did not do this." "I know," she said. "I'm still sorry." He seemed to think about this, about the specific meaning of an apology for something you didn't cause. It was, she suspected, Another of those places where their languages had different architecture. His people had forms of communal responsibility, ways of acknowledging that what one person did created ripples that touched everyone in their world. But personal apology for a communal harm. That was a different form, and she could see him turning it over. Finally, he said, "This is a kind thing." "It's a human thing," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "I'm learning this." February brought a crisis that changed the terms of their relationship in ways neither of them had planned. A party of soldiers from the fort had been moving through the territory on one of the regular patrols that were a fact of life in the region. And there had been an encounter. The details were murky and contested, as such details always were, and Clara would never have a completely clear account of exactly what happened. What she knew was that a member of Neshota's band, a young man, barely 20 like named by the older warriors as someone to watch, had been killed. Shot in what the army called a justified action and what the band called an ambush, and the truth was somewhere in the contested ground between those two words where most truths in the territory lived. She, I think, heard about it in town 3 days after it happened, from a trader who came through regularly and whose version of events could be trusted to be more accurate than most, because he had no particular interest in flattering either side. She heard it, and she felt a cold, particular weight settle in her chest, not because she knew for certain that the kind of young man had been close to Neshota, but because she knew that this was the kind of loss that reverberates through a small, tight community in specific and devastating ways. The following Tuesday, she went to the Flat Rock. She went early, and she waited 2 hours past the time Neshota usually arrived. The desert was very quiet. She watched a hawk work the thermals above the ridge and thought about the word he had taught her in January, the grief that builds, and tried to understand it from the inside of it. He came down from the ridge at last, and she could see from the way he moved still that careful, quiet walk, but something held differently in his shoulders that he knew she had heard. They sat. She said nothing at first. He said nothing. They sat together in the February sun for a long time in the particular silence of two people who have moved, without ceremony, past the stage of needing to fill every space with words. Finally, he said, "He was my cousin." She said, "I know. I am sorry." He nodded once. He picked up a small flat stone and turned it over in his hands. The same kind of gesture she had begun to recognize in him, the handling of something physical when the inner world was moving too fast for still hands. She said, "Are you safe? Is your band safe?" He looked at her. "For now. Is there anything I can do?" This question seemed to land differently than she expected. He looked at her for a long moment, that careful, assessing look that she had come to associate with him processing something complex, and said, "You have already done." She did not know exactly what he meant. She thought she understood something of it. In the 5 months since the Flat Rock, she had become, through no intention and no plan, a kind of thread between two worlds that were, in most respects, at war with each other. Not a diplomat, not a negotiator, and just a person who sat every Tuesday at a Flat Rock with a tin of tea and a medicine bag and a phonetically transcribed vocabulary notebook, and who had demonstrated, through the simple consistency of showing up, that it was possible for a person from one of those worlds to see a person from the other as a person. It wasn't enough. She knew that. It wasn't enough to undo the Camp Grant massacre or the death of a 20-year-old cousin or 300 years of conflict. She wasn't so naive as to think that individual kindness scaled up to systemic justice through some simple mechanism of goodwill. She had grown up in this territory. She knew the shape of the violence and the structures that produced it. Individual kindness wasn't the solution, but it was also not nothing. She sat with Neshota in the winter sun until the light began to tip toward late afternoon, and then she said she needed to walk back before dark. He stood when she stood. He looked at her and said something in Apache that she did not have the vocabulary for yet. She raised her eyebrows. He was quiet for a moment, finding the English equivalent. Finally, he said, "You are someone who stays." She thought about this walking home. She thought about it that evening and several evenings after. You are someone who stays. It was, she thought, the most straightforward description of her that anyone had ever offered. Not a compliment. Exactly, or not only a compliment. More like an observation. A precise, actually, and considered one. Her mother, in a letter that arrived in early March, asked again when she was coming home. Honestly, home, meaning Boston. Home, meaning a city she had visited once at age 7 and remembered primarily as very loud and very gray. She sat down and wrote back, "I'm home, Mother. I've always been home here. I know you don't understand this, and I'm not sure I can explain it, but I think it's something to do with staying." She sealed the letter and put it on the outgoing mail pile and did not think further about Boston. Spring arrived, which in the Sonoran Desert means not a slow warming, but a sudden insistent flowering. The ocotillo throwing up its red blooms overnight, the saguaro putting out its crown of white flowers, the desert going from dry silver to green and gold almost between 1 week and the next. Clara loved this transition more than any other thing the territory offered. It was so completely without equivocation. The desert did not hesitantly suggest spring. It declared it. She brought a saguaro flower to the flat rock one Tuesday. She had picked it that morning before it fully opened, which made it legitimate from a practical standpoint, since the bees had not yet found, and held it out toward Nishoda with no particular explanation. He took it. He looked at it. He said something in Apache. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," he said slowly, "the thing that insists on happening." He paused. "We say this about the saguaro. In my opinion, every year. The winter tries. The cold tries. The saguaro does this anyway." He turned the flower in his fingers. "I think your people have a word, stubborn." "Stubborn," she confirmed. "In my opinion, yes," he said. "But not bad stubborn. Good stubborn, and the kind that—" He searched for words. "The kind that's right." She looked at the flower in his hands. "Tenacious," she said. "That's the word. It, to be fair, means stubborn in the right direction." He repeated it. Tenacious, which sounded it out. Filed it away. She had been keeping a second notebook for several months by this point, a record not of vocabulary, but of conversations. Not, I guess, verbatim transcripts, because she wasn't fast enough and the vocabulary was still incomplete, but summaries and observations and the specific things he said that she wanted to remember exactly. She wouldn't know, for what it's worth at the time of writing, what to do with this record. She wasn't a writer. She had not thought of herself as someone preserving history. She was only doing what her father had done, paying attention, and writing down what she observed because the act of writing forced her to look more carefully. These notebooks would survive. Several of them would eventually find their way to an archive. They would become, long after Clara's death, a primary source for historians trying to understand what cross-cultural contact actually looked like at the ground level in the Arizona Territory in the 1870s. Honestly, not the official record of treaties and military dispatches, but the human record of two people learning each other's language in a desert one Tuesday at a time. But that was later. Plus, in the spring of 1875, she was simply a young woman who wrote things down because writing helped her think, and thinking helped her be present for what was happening, and being present for what was happening felt more and more like the most important thing she could do. The most important thing. She sat with, in my opinion, that phrase sometimes. She had grown up being told that importance was a large-scale matter, that you served God through the church, served the community through the mission, served the future through the proper ordering of the present. These were not wrong things, exactly, but they were abstract. The flat rock wasn't abstract. The Tuesday, I think, meetings were not abstract. The notebooks filling up with phonetic transcriptions and conversation summaries and the particular vocabulary of a language that had words for things her own language had never needed to name. These were not abstract. She was, in my opinion, doing something here. She did not know yet exactly what. But she was doing it, and it was real, and the man across from her in the spring light, turning a saguaro flower in his careful hands, was real, and whatever was being built between them, one word, one Tuesday, one small and consistent act of showing up, was as real as the flat rock beneath them and the desert around them and the particular insisting green of the territory in spring. She would understand more of what she was building and more of what it would cost her, more of what it would give her as the year went on. But the foundation was here. It had been here since the first morning when she had knelt in the dirt with shaking hands and done the only thing she knew how to do. You're someone who stays. Yes, she thought, turning her face up toward the April sun. Yes, that pretty much is exactly what I am. There's a particular kind of courage that isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, which it doesn't arrive in a single defining moment of declared bravery. It accumulates quietly, steadily, almost invisibly in the daily decisions of a person who has chosen to keep doing something difficult because the alternative is to stop being who they're. Clara Whitfield had this kind of courage. She had been building it for years before she understood that was what she was doing. By the summer of 1875, her life had rearranged itself around a center that was, in almost every practical sense, unsanctioned. The Tuesday meetings at the Flat Rock had become something that the town of Tucson wouldn't have approved of if it hadn't known about them, and there were people in town who suspected, though none who could claim to know for certain. She was careful. She wasn't secretive in the way of someone hiding a shame, but she was private in the way of someone protecting something real from people who might not understand it, and would therefore damage it. She had learned kind of early that some things need protecting not from malice, but from incomprehension. Sister Agnes knew something was different. She was a perceptive woman, Sister Agnes, sharper than she let on, in the way of people who have lived long in difficult circumstances and learned that observation is safer than speech. She asked Clara once in the spring of 1875 whether she was safe. Clara had looked at her directly and said yes. Sister Agnes had looked back with the expression of a woman who was choosing to believe true answer to a question that had not been fully asked, and they had left it at that. Nashoda's, grandmother knew about Clara before Clara knew the grandmother existed. This wasn't surprising in retrospect. He had told his family about the woman at the Flat Rock, had been telling them she gathered from roughly the second or third Tuesday meeting, which was when it had become clear that the meetings were not a single isolated event, but something ongoing. His grandmother, the formidable woman whose opinions on preparation and patience he had described in their early conversations, had apparently had a great many opinions about this development. He relayed some of them to Clara with a careful neutrality that she suspected cost him some effort. The grandmother's primary concern wasn't, as Clara might have expected, distrust of a white woman from the mission house. Her primary concern was practical. What did this woman want, and what was she taking in exchange for the help she appeared to be giving? This, in my opinion, wasn't cynicism, it was experience. In a grandmother's long life in the territory, things that were offered freely had a way of becoming expensive. She had seen this pattern enough times to treat generosity from outside her community as something that required investigation before trust. He had told her, apparently, that he had asked himself the same question many times and had not found an answer that fit the usual patterns. Clara apparently wanted nothing that he could identify, not information, not access, not some form of social credit with the authorities in town. She came. She helped, and she sat. She went home. She came back. The grandmother had said, and he translated this with the careful precision of a man who's managing his own reaction to the content, that if this was true, it was either the sign of a very simple person or a very complicated one, and that either way, watching and waiting was the correct response. She sounds, Clara said, like a very wise woman. Yes, he said. She's right that I want something, Clara said. He looked at her. I want to understand. I want sort of to know more than I know. I want. She paused, trying to be accurate. I want this to be possible. This. She gestured between them, the space between her and the Flat Rock and him and the Red Ridge beyond. People seeing each other. Across all of it. I want that to be possible because I need it to be possible. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why do you need it? She had not expected to be asked this. She basically thought about it honestly. Because I guess I grew up here, she said. This is my home. Your land is my home. I can't love a place and not love the people who are in it. And I can't be here and not try to understand what I'm here inside of. She looked at him. Does that make sense? He considered it. Yes, he said. It is a version of something my grandmother says. She says, a person who doesn't know their territory will eventually be destroyed by it. She means land, but perhaps this is also true for. He searched for words. For the people inside the land. That's exactly it, Clara said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. I'll tell her for what it's worth. You said this. Please, Clara said. And then, because she was Clara Whitfield and she had a kind of quiet nerve that other people sometimes mistook for recklessness, I'd like to meet her. He did not answer immediately. She actually had not expected him to. Plus, she had honestly planted a seed, The way you plant seeds in dry ground, without expectation, without urgency, simply putting the possibility into the soil and letting it find its own way. The summer moved through its stages, and the heat in Tucson between June and September was a serious physical phenomenon. Not just uncomfortable, but consequential, the kind of heat that required management and respect. Clara understood the desert heat the way she understood most things in her life, as a fact requiring a practical response. She wore sort of light cotton and drank water consistently and worked in the early mornings and late afternoons when the light was at angles rather than straight overhead. She did not complain about the heat because she had grown up in it, and complaining about the climate of the place you chose to live seemed to her a particular kind of ingratitude. Their Tuesday meetings moved to early morning in the summer, before the heat built. She would leave the mission house before sunrise and reach the flat rock as the sky was going from black to the particular deep blue that preceded dawn in the desert. And he was usually already there. She had never beaten him to the rock, not once in the entire history of their meetings, and she had eventually stopped trying. In July, he brought her a gift. She had been actually coming empty-handed to the meetings for a while. She still brought tea sometimes, but she had stopped bringing prepared offerings because she had come to understand that in his culture, the regular bringing of prepared things carried a particular social implication, a statement of care that was specific and serious, and she did not want to claim a meaning she wasn't sure she had. She had learned this from his sister, Dolly, who had become, somewhat unexpectedly, a secondary correspondent in the growing communication network that was Clara's life by 1875. Dolly and, well, Clara had met finally in June. He had arranged it carefully and with what Clara had come to recognize as his characteristic approach to anything sensitive. He had told both of them separately, had given both of them time, had shown up with Dolly one Tuesday morning without drama or ceremony, had introduced them by each of their names, and had then sat down and let them deal with. Dolly was 22, 2 years younger than Clara, with the same quality of precise attention in her eyes that ran in the family. She had no English at all at that point, but she had clearly been briefed thoroughly by her brother because she studied Clara with an expression that wasn't hostile, but was deeply thorough, the expression of someone who has been told a great deal and is now calibrating the information against the reality. Clara, who had grown up being assessed by people in difficult circumstances and had a high tolerance for being accurately observed, sat still and returned the look with what she hoped was comparable openness. After about 10 minutes of this, Dolly said something to her brother that was apparently brief and conclusive. He translated it as, "She says your hands are like your father's." Clara looked at her own hands, the hands that had dressed his wound on the flat rock a year ago, the hands that were never quite clean because she was always working with herbs or medicines or soil, the hands that were scarred at the base of the right thumb from a childhood accident and calloused from years of carrying the medicine bag. "How does she know what my father's hands looked like?" Clara asked. "She doesn't," he said. "She means they look like hands that belong to healing. That pretty much this is what they're for." Clara looked at Dolly. Dolly looked back with a very slight upturn at one corner of her mouth. They understood each other at that moment in a way that required no translation at all. The gift he brought in July was a piece of worked leather, a small wrist cuff fitted for a woman's arm, decorated with a geometric pattern in natural dyes that she would later learn had a specific meaning she did not yet have the vocabulary to read. He placed it on the rock between them, which was the way he always presented things, setting them in the neutral space between, never pushing them forward, leaving the choice entirely with the other person. She picked it up. She looked at the pattern. She looked at him. "What does the pattern mean?" she asked. He was quiet, kind of, for a moment. Then, in our, he paused, choosing his word, in our visual language. "This pattern." He traced one of the geometric lines with one finger. "It is for someone who walks in two territories at once without losing their footing in either." She sat with this for a long time. The sort of morning was still cool, the sun not yet above the ridge, and the desert was very quiet except for the birds in the scrub brush, and the very distant sound of the town beginning its day to the east. "Did your grandmother make this?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, but she had been watching his face for over a year, and she caught it. "Yes," he said. "She put on. She wore it every day for the rest of her life." The fall of 1875 was when things became dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of knife wounds and ambushes. that was always present, a background condition of the territory that she had learned to carry without being destroyed by it. Dangerous in a different sense. The danger that comes when a situation that TBH has been invisible becomes visible, and the people around it haven't been prepared for what they'll see. The particular shape of the danger was this: a man named Harlan Decker. Harlan Decker was a land agent. He had arrived in Tucson in August of 1875 with a commission from a group of Eastern investors who wanted to develop a water access point on the northern edge of the territory, a water source that was currently contested between the Army, several ranching operations, and the Apache bands whose seasonal patterns had included that water source for longer than anyone could calculate with paper records. He wasn't a violent man in the direct physical sense. He was too careful for that, too aware of his own interests. But he was a man who understood that information was a resource, and that in a place where power was contested, information about other people's vulnerabilities was the most valuable resource of all. He noticed Clara. More in particular, he noticed her absence from the mission house on Tuesday mornings, and her return at midday, and he noticed that she returned from these absences with the particular quality of a person who's been doing something private and important, and he was the kind of man who made it his business to understand things that other people wanted to keep to themselves. She did not know he was watching her for several weeks. She learned it through Sister Agnes, who came to her in October with the careful, specific unease of a woman delivering information she wishes. She did not have. Harlan Decker had asked, in the way that men like Harlan Decker ask things, where Clara went on Tuesday mornings. Clara received this, I think, information quietly, and went to bed that night and thought about it until very late. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and wrote for 2 hours, not in her vocabulary notebook or her conversation record, but in a new document, a careful and detailed account of everything she knew about the water rights dispute in the Northern Territory, written from the perspective of everything she had learned over the past year from Neshota, not in a way that exposed his band's specific location or movements, but in a way that documented the legitimate claims and the cultural significance of the disputed area in language that she hoped might be useful in some official forum. She wasn't a lawyer. She had no formal authority and no political standing. She was a 25-year-old missionary's daughter with a medicine bag and a collection of phonetic vocabulary notebooks. But she had grown up in this territory, and she had spent a year listening very carefully, and she understood the shape of what was at stake in a way that she wasn't willing to pretend she didn't understand. She also wrote a letter to the Army commander at the fort. She wrote it carefully, in her best and most formal language, and she stated plainly that she had reason to believe the water rights dispute in the Northern Territory was being approached with incomplete information about the Apache claims, and that she was available to provide contextual information about the affected communities. She actually signed it with her full name and her father's title, daughter of Reverend William Whitfield, Tucson Territory Mission, because she understood, without cynicism, that authority was often conferred by association, and that her father's name still carried weight in the territory even 4 years after his death. She did not tell Neshota about any of this immediately. She, I think, needed to think more carefully before she brought him into it. But she told him about Decker. She went to the Flat Rock the following Tuesday, and she told him in the direct and specific language they had built over 14 months of Tuesday mornings that someone had noticed their meetings and that she did not know yet what would be done with that information. He was quiet while she told him. He had like a way of being quiet that wasn't passive. It was actively attentive, a quality of listening that was physical, as if the whole of him was oriented toward what was being said. When she finished, he sat for a moment. "Are you in danger?" he asked. "TBH, not physically," she said. "Plus, but possibly from reputation, from what people will say if they decide to say it." He looked at the Flat Rock. "And the band? Are they in my opinion, danger from this?" "I don't know," she said. "Possibly. That's why I'm telling you." Another silence. She waited. She had learned to wait. "My grandmother, in my opinion," he said at last. She said this would come. She said when the time came that it cost something, we would know if the thing was real. Clara looked at him. What did she mean by real? He met her eyes. "She means things that are real have a weight that you can feel. Things that aren't real feel light. Easy, kind of no cost." He paused. She says, "Don't trust things that have no cost." Clara thought about the years she had spent kneeling by bedsides, walking before dawn to gather herbs, building a vocabulary in a language that was difficult for her in ways she couldn't always explain to herself. She thought about the letter she had written the night before, signed with her own name. She thought about the leather cuff on her wrist with its pattern of a person walking in two territories. "This costs," she said, which, yes, he said. "My grandmother says this is how we know it's real." She went to see the army commander 2 weeks later. She dressed carefully, her Sunday clothes, her father's Bible tucked under her arm as a signifier she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but recognized as practical. And she walked to the fort and asked to speak with Captain Morrison, who was responsible for the Northern Territory Patrol operations. She was made to wait 45 minutes in a chair outside his office, which she suspected was a communication in itself, and she sat through it with the patience of a person who has spent a year learning to wait. Captain Morrison was a practical man, not cruel, not stupid, but shaped by his context in the way that all people are shaped by theirs. He had, honestly, a set of frameworks for understanding the territory and the people in it, and Clara's arrival did not fit neatly into any of those frameworks. She was the late Reverend Whitfield's daughter, which meant she was respectable. She was young and single, which in 1875 meant she was potentially credulous or naive. She actually appeared to have specific knowledge about the Apache band in the Northern Water dispute, which meant she either had legitimate access or had done something inadvisable. She told him what she knew. Plus, she was careful, and she was specific, and she was accurate. She told him about the traditional significance of the water source and the seasonal patterns that depended on it. She told him about the Camp Grant aftermath and the fear and suspicion that made any negotiation in the territory almost impossibly fragile. She told him that the failure mode of the current situation wasn't dramatic confrontation, but the slow erosion of any possible trust, which would make the territory ungovernable not in a year, but in a decade, and that a decade of that kind of erosion would cost more lives than any single confrontation. Morrison listened. He had the, expression of a man encountering an argument he had not expected from the quarter it was coming from. He asked her, carefully, how she had come to be in possession of this information. "My father raised me to pay attention," she said, which was true and not entirely an answer. "And I've spent, in my opinion, a great deal of time listening." He looked at her for a moment. Then, he said he would take her information under advisement. He said it in the tone of a man who was managing an unexpected situation, and she recognized the tone and understood that this wasn't a victory. It kind of was at best a small increment, a foot in a door. She walked back to the mission house in the October afternoon light and thought about increments. She thought about how change moved in places like the territory, not in dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of small acts, small meetings, small moments of one person actually listening to another. She thought about 14 months of Tuesday mornings and a vocabulary notebook and a grandmother who had made a wrist cuff for a woman she had not yet met because she had looked at the evidence and decided provisionally, conditionally, with clear eyes that this woman might be someone who could be trusted. Harlan Decker left Tucson in November. She never learned exactly why. She suspected the letter she had written had something to do with it, or the meeting with Morrison, or possibly the simple fact that the investment his clients wanted to make became less appealing when the water rights situation turned out to be more complex than the initial assessment had suggested. He left as he had arrived, without ceremony, and carrying information that could have done damage and didn't. She thought about this for a long time. About the fact that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply make the cost of harm too high, not through confrontation, but through the patient, deliberate work of making the truth legible to the people who might otherwise have been willing to ignore it. She went to the Flat Rock on the following Tuesday and sat in the November cold and drank her tea and waited. He came down from the ridge, the same careful walk, the same particular quality of moving quietly through open country. He sat across from her. She poured tea into the second cup and set it on the rock between them. He picked it up. He drank. Plus, he looked at her. "He is gone," he said. It wasn't a question. "In my opinion, yes," she said. He nodded once. He looked out well at the desert, the silver scrub, and the red rock, and the enormous November sky. "My grandmother," he said. "She wants to meet you." Clara looked at him. He was looking, I guess, at the desert, not at her, in the way he looked at things when he was saying something that mattered more than he was showing. But she had learned his face the way she had learned his language, slowly, precisely, with complete attention. She could read the quality of what was there underneath the stillness. When, she said. When you are ready, he said. She thought about shaking hands and a medicine bag and 2 syllables she hadn't understood, and a year of Tuesdays, and a pattern on a leather cuff that meant a person who walks in 2 territories without losing their footing in either, and the specific weight of things that are real. I'm ready, she said. He looked at her then, and, in my opinion, in his face, in that careful, steady face that she had spent 14 months learning to read, she saw something that did not have a word in English. Something his language would have named, she thought. Something with 4 pretty much syllables and a quality in the mouth, like something being gathered up rather than let go. The grief that builds. Sort of no, not that. Look, something else. Something she did not have the word for yet, but would. The desert was like very still around them. The basically sky was the particular deep blue of late autumn in the Sonoran, cold and clear and infinite. Somewhere on a ridge above them, a hawk was working the last of the day's thermals, rising in long, slow circles, patient and purposeful, going exactly where it meant to go. She finished her tea. She stood up. She was ready.